Chapter 17, Section 3, The Allies Turn the Tide. All-out war. To defeat the Axis war machine, the Allies had to commit themselves to total war, so putting all of their resources into the war. The U.S. and Great Britain increased their political power during the war. They directed economic resources into the war effort, so instead of making cars or refrigerators and factories, they made airplanes and tanks. While the war brought some shortages and hardships, the increase in production ended the unemployment of the Depression era. Under pressures of war, even democratic governments limited the rights of their citizens, censored press, and used propaganda to win support of the war effort. In the U.S. and in Canada, citizens of Japanese heritage were sent to internment camps. As men joined the war, millions of women replaced them in essential war industry jobs. The Allies forged ahead. The years 1942 to 43 marked a turning point in the war. Allies won victories on the four fronts: the Pacific, North Africa and Italy, the Soviet Union, and France, to push back the Axis tide. The Japanese suffered their first serious setback at the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a devastating blow to the Japanese. After Midway, Japan was unable to launch any more offensive operations, and because of this, that's why it's known as a turning point in the war in the Pacific. And there's a new movie out called Midway that's really good that's all about that battle. In 1942, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, agreed to focus on finishing the war in Europe before trying to end the war in the Pacific. However, there were tensions and disagreements between the three. In November 1942, the Allies finally halted the Axis powers through North Africa at the Battle of El Alamein. With North Africa under the control, the Allies were able to cross the Mediterranean Sea into Sicily. In July 1943, the British and U.S. forces landed in Sicily, then in southern Italy, and defeated the Italian forces in about a month. After the defeats, Italians overthrew Mussolini and signed an armistice. But Hitler sent German troops to rescue Mussolini. For 18 months, the battle for Italy raged on. The Italian invasion weakened Hitler by forcing him to fight on another front. A major turning point occurred in the Soviet Union. The battle for Stalingrad was one of the costliest of the war. Hitler was determined to capture Stalin's namesake city. Stalin was equally determined to defend it. It was a bitter street-by-street, house-by-house battle. Trapped without food or ammunition, the Germans surrendered in January 1943. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the Red Army took the offensive and drove the invaders out of the Soviet Union entirely. By early 1944, Soviet troops were advancing into Eastern Europe. The Allies pushed towards Germany. By 1944, the Allies were at last ready to open a second front in Europe by invading France. The Allies chose June 6, 1944, known as D-Day. Just before midnight on June 5th, Allied planes dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines. Then at dawn, thousands of ships carried 156,000 Allied troops across the English Channel. And there's a fantastic graphic on 584 and 585 to see more numbers and more details about the invasion. The D-Day invasion was a success. The Allied forces were able to get a foothold on France. By August 25, 1944, the Allies entered Paris, and within a month, all of France was free. For 2 years, Allied bombers had hammered German military bases, factories, railroads, and cities. The goal of this kind of bombing was to cripple German industries and to destroy the morale of its civilians. Allied bombing raids killed 40,000 civilians in Hamburg and 135,000 people in Dresden. By early 1945, the defeat of Germany was inevitable. At a conference in Yalta in February, the Big Three met to discuss the end of the war. It was agreed that the Soviets would join the war against Japan in return for Asian land, and that Germans would temporarily be divided into 4 zones. Stalin also agreed to hold free elections in Eastern Europe.